Happy Thursday morning, everybody. Welcome back to the Tropical MBA podcast. We're all about time and location flexibility, building these incredible businesses while pursuing wealth. We're going to talk about a lot of grab bag topics today, things I've been thinking about, things I found on the web. I wrote up little mini essays and I'm going to share them with you today. So let's roll it. I want to react to what's happening with DOGE, or the Department of Governmental Efficiency here in America. It's headed up by Elon Musk, who is indisputably, whatever you think about the man, is one of the most talented entrepreneurs of all time. So there's some methodology here to the chaos that it has created. And if you read the news, you see the chaos. Obviously, a lot of people have lost their jobs, and it must be, a horrible situation for them to be in. However, I think we can take a look at this and get a sense for how it could or could not apply to our businesses. So there's two key areas here. The first is this methodology of a zero-based budget. In our company, for some weird banking reason, every year we had to get new credit cards from our bank. I think we've fixed this and we've put it in a process. But it was kind of this really interesting moment where all of our subscriptions would get canceled every year. And you could do this with your personal credit cards too. It's really interesting. What would you go and resubscribe to? And this is a concept of, instead of benchmarking over what you did last year, you benchmark from zero. And so when we do coaching calls, for example, one of our diagnostic questions is, would you rehire your team? And this is another zero-based way of thinking. Let's look at our revenue. Let's look at our different product lines and ask ourselves, what do they need to be successful? And especially with us, our biggest operational expense will be our team. So these things change so quickly that benchmarking off of last year can often be super inefficient and ineffective. I think a lot of people avoid doing this because they just want to keep it rolling. They want to avoid dynamic change and some element of chaos or conflict. So you don't need necessarily to do anything about it, but it is interesting from an intellectual perspective to ask yourself, from zero, would I rehire this team? And you can use a concept like, for example, labor efficiency ratio. You can take a particular product line and its gross profit and make sure that your headcount supporting that gross profit is under a 2.0 ratio. This is a concept from Greg Crabtree. And it's important for entrepreneurs because often we will over-invest in products or ideas thinking it will help get them off the ground, and often it just doesn't work out. And so zero-based budgeting is a way for us to encounter that reality, to face it down and ask ourselves how we can adjust. So this is where we get into a lot of trouble, where we just keep it rolling year over year. It's like, oh, I'm going to reduce it by 10%. Oh, I'm going to increase it by 10%. It's like, wait a second, let's start from scratch. Would we rehire this team? Does this make sense right now? So really what I'm seeing from DOGE is just a basic entrepreneurial principle of zero-based versus benchmarking from the previous year. The other principle I'm seeing in DOGE is basic accountability for effectiveness, and doing this through writing or vocalization. We do it on a daily huddle. We do it through a scoreboard in the company where we're looking at green, yellow, and red metrics, and someone on the team owns those metrics. You can do this through a variety of different ways. A weekly report at minimum, again, your largest capital expense, it should be a minimum requirement that every week they are telling you not only what they did, but how it affected the numbers that they are responsible for. So these are just two basic block and tackle principles that we can take from the Elon Musk playbook and apply it to our small businesses. There's a leaked audio from the CEO of JP Morgan, this guy, Jamie Dimon. It's interesting. He's basically cursing out his staff. And I see this a lot where, their public appearance is nice. And then they're just this savage a-hole behind the scenes. I don't know. He was just tough. I actually didn't think he seemed unfair. But if you listen to the audio, he was real tough, and it's like, well, that's what it takes to be at the top. This tough mindset. And his perspective was, work from home is a joke, essentially. Nobody can get a hold of you. We don't have the creativity. People are screwing around, and we can't be the best bank in the world if people are off screwing around. Now, for those of us with remote companies, are we all just screwballs? Is there an element of truth to this? I think so. Yeah, I do think that there is an intensity and an accountability to being there in a pressed suit. I do think so. But the trade-offs are enormous. And there's a lot of sort of lifestyle costs for every single person involved in the organization. It takes time to press that suit, to buy it, to get on the train, to get in your car, to show up. What we found is that a hybrid element seems to be the best. So if, for example, you were to pull your whole team back into an office, which is a fantasy that a lot of remote founders have, what you find is that the returns start to diminish after a few weeks. So I do think there's this opportunity to sort of borrow from both sides of the aisle, because there's tremendous amount of efficiency in letting people just wake up and go right to their computer, to not have to commute, to be able to work while they're traveling, to not have to hire in a geographical area. So these are all enormous upsides. And forget about the fact of your own lifestyle as the founder. So what I would recommend is two things. The first is a harder core virtual office. And for us, that looks like the daily huddle. So it's all about effectiveness. It's all about clear thinking and communication. We show up, here's what I'm doing. This is a way to get some of that in-person control. You can have standards for that meeting. How do you show up? What is your camera setup? What is your desk setup? You can control those things like you can in an office. You can have mandatory working sessions where people are having creative jam sessions over video. So you can introduce some of this office concept into your remote business. The other two ways is when you onboard somebody, it is typically excellent to work with them for a few weeks. So use it as a travel opportunity, or do it at your next, my third point, your team retreat. So you can have working sessions with the entire team. You can do this in relatively low cost areas, and you can, demonstrate for the team what working hard or what your culture looks like in those areas. So I think with a combination of these virtual office type systems combined with in-person onboarding on occasion, especially with key leadership team members, and then regular team retreats where everybody can get together. And here's a bonus tip. Why not do it with your customers? So if you have a gathering for your customers and clients, bring the entire team into that. You're going to get a lot of upside from getting everybody in one room. So yeah, I've always thought there's this fantasy for remote workers. Man, if everybody was just in the office, but then you think of all the costs of doing it, all the lifestyle costs of doing it. And then that real fact that, man, it really diminishes after some time in the office together. Now, instead of being collaborative and creative, we're just trying to box people out to get some work done. And so I think the value of having a completely remote global business is that you can borrow from the best of each world. I just want to do a quick refresher on the 1,000-day principle, and really a topic that I think I could write a full book about, because as you get deeper into this concept, there's a lot that reveals itself. But very briefly at the top, the 1,000-day principle, which I have stolen from my friend David McKeegan, who's an incredible entrepreneur. He came to me one time and I was basically saying man, entrepreneurship sounds so great. Why aren't there more people that are doing it? It's so much fun, Look at us. We're doing what we want. We're traveling around, blah, blah, blah. And he's like, look, here's the reason, is because people aren't willing to endure 1,000 days of making less money than they were in their profession. There's a variety of reasons they're not willing to do it. It represents risk to them. That's why there's not more entrepreneurs. And I thought this was really interesting. Wow, 1,000 days. It's a lot, but not that much. And a lot of successful entrepreneurs can always point back to those 1,000 days as something that they really endured. And as I went around, I found that this pattern has repeated itself. And so what does the first, say, year, 1,000 days is about 3 years. So what does the first year look like? It typically is going to look like a race to getting your product or service out the door as quickly as possible, your MVP, as they say. And the worst thing you can do typically if you're undercapitalized and you're taking on a risk, like digging into savings or quitting a job, is to build a product that requires a lot of money. So we want to find something where we can have the MVP as soon as possible and then focus on our channel. Typically a startup business needs one channel. You need a perspective on where a reliable source of customers is coming from, and you need to focus on sales. For a lot of us, it's going to be, hey, I'm going to conferences, I'm talking to people, and I'm selling my services or product to them. For a lot of us, it's going to be an SEO channel or a social media channel. So knowing your channel and how you are getting reliable source of customers from that channel is something you need to systematize immediately. For us in the very early days, it was simply our rankings on Google, keyword clicks and intention, and the funnel on our e-commerce site. It doesn't matter how good the product is, the business does not exist if it isn't for that channel. So that first year of the 1,000-day principle, digging into savings, quitting our jobs, we're freaking out a little bit. We can start to de-risk it by understanding the channel. How many people are coming through? How valuable are they? How well are they converting? And how fast are they paying? That's year one. Year two is typically going to be, now we're taking another step back financially because we're getting progress. Now we have to hire to fulfill, right? We need customer service people. We need product people. So again, this is what everybody talks about in entrepreneurship. Year two of the 1,000-day principle is when you're paying other people more than you're paying yourself. Now, the important thing to think about when you're doing this is it's tempting to hire for sales and marketing at this point. Like if I just hired a social person, if I just hired this, they're going to grow the business. 9 times out of 10, the people that you hire at this phase in a business will not grow your business. So what does that mean? That means that they need to be delivering the value proposition and you need to be growing the service. Now, I'd love for this to be different. I've always looked for exceptions to this, but it just seems like 9 times out of 10, that responsibility is on the founder still. So keep that in mind when you're hiring. I think this is why the 1,000-day principle resonates with so many founders, because like every year it's like, oh, another thing. I can't magically hire an Instagram person and they're going to blow up my business. Like, yeah, no, because you actually don't have enough capital to hire somebody who's actually effective at that. Because if you trust what I said in the first year, which is the channel is everything, people who understand these channels, they're not going to work for you, right? They're going to go out and have their own business. Or is it just doesn't seem to work? You tell me if you've made it work, because I'm still looking. Okay, year number 3. Through this whole 1,000 days, by the way, a lot of the people around you, especially if they have jobs, they're not necessarily supportive of this whole process. And maybe this is changing. Entrepreneurship's getting more popular, but keep in mind that like looking for validation from your social network that aren't weirdo entrepreneurs is usually a fruitless task. And it's very tempting because it's a very challenging time in your life. So I recommend hanging out with other entrepreneurs and looking for validation in the results you are achieving. It helps to be quiet about this stuff because the sort of people with jobs, they just look at things a little bit differently. And you have to go through what looks like a very risky process in order to build a durable business that can create wealth and time and location freedom. So part of the idea of the 1,000-day principle is that you're not going to be getting a lot of outside validation typically as you're going through these 1,000 days. The third year is really when you should cross the hump of you've been able to hire for the product delivery and development. So ideally, you would be able to leave the business for 2 to 3 weeks in the third year, and it runs without you. Now, this is an interesting benchmark because I spoke with David about this some years after we had the initial conversation. He's basically like, if you're not tracking through these 1,000 days, you kind of have a problem on your hands because you should have been able to sort of figure this out for this channel, for this product, for this audience within those first 1,000 days. So if you've been grinding and bleeding cash, you probably are taking on too much risk. And it's typically one of three problem areas. The first would be that you just haven't found a reliable way to acquire customers. And so you've been spending those 1,000 days doing other stuff, maybe developing the next good idea. But what we want to find is the channels and the reliable sources of customers. It could be simply a poor founder fit. You could have a decent idea, but you might not be the best person to execute that idea. It's important because in a way, because you're foregoing a professional salary, you are the company's biggest expense. So in these early days, you also have to be the top performer. And that's why these 3 years can be so difficult. I know the idea of a business is you set it up, it runs itself. And that's a cool idea. It just doesn't typically happen in the first 3 years. That dream of business ownership often happens way later in the game, year 5, 6, 7, 8, when the business has systems, processes, great people, and a durable model. And typically you're not seeing that in the first few years. You're still figuring things out. The final piece, it could simply be low productivity and effectiveness. Maybe we're still carrying some of that job mindset, just show up, do the work. A lot of what the 1,000-day principle is trying to express and trying to commiserate in the community of entrepreneurs is that sometimes we look back on it and we're like, wow, I can't believe so much got done. It's really about time compression. Like we're taking a season of our lives and we're producing maybe way more than we've ever produced before in terms of our output, in terms of our decision-making, in terms of total amount of hours spent focused on one small problem in the universe. So perhaps a shift to finding a way to be more productive and effective. Often this can look like going to work for an incredible founder and getting a sense for what their bar is and getting a sense for what's possible and then taking that know-how back into your entrepreneurial efforts. So that's it, the 1,000-day principle. It's a simple pattern. It's a simple benchmark. Because of the way business works, for whatever reason, it's out there in the universe, you would typically make less on your own business in the first 3 years than you would working a professional job. Not always the case. I hope for you that you will be the exception. So many founders know or believe they should be posting more online, on social, video, writing, all this kind of stuff, but they don't do it because one of two things. It's like imposter syndrome, or let's call it practitioner syndrome. Like if you're a high-level practitioner doing something every day, often it will be the case that you don't think it's interesting because you're doing it all the time. And so then when founders attempt to create media on the web, they end up having their marketing team churn out boring stuff that looks like what everybody else is doing. So here's a method where you can get started on creating niche media content that appeals to your ideal client profile. So it's really simple. It's actually like a Google Calendar hack. So the way you can remind yourself of how your company and you particularly are interesting is by inventorying the phone calls you have with your clients. Now, if you don't have calls with your clients, go out and generate them, right? With your customers, get them on the phone and talk to them about what you're doing, what they're doing, the value exchange that's occurring. And then after the call, take 10 minutes to write about it. That is the content that will appeal to your ICP because it appealed to them just now. You have the proof is in the pudding. Create a media version of the call. So you can do this in Google Calendar when you set up, say, an hour-long client call. In fact, this is a version of that, right? I just got off the phone with a client, and you can use it as a feature where nobody else can book a call within 15 minutes. Use that 15 minutes to reflect on the call and to create a piece of content that reflects the challenges, the problems, the excitement that was discussed on the call. What is the problem to be solved? What is the core problem that you discussed with that client? And what is the unique way you can go about solving it? That's the framework. That's what you're going to do in the 10 to 15 minutes. It's like, well, what is the angle, the unique kind of twist on the problem that this particular client is facing? guarantee there's someone else out there in the world that could be a great client for you that has the same problem. Now, this is where you come in. What's the unique way in which they can go about solving that problem? Super simple. So now if you've got 10 calls a week, you've got 10 pieces of content. And often what you'll find is your creative juices get going and you can make multiple responses to just one challenge that you hear from a client. This is a super simple way to remind yourself of, hey, these people are signing up for calls with you. Obviously, you're interesting. So create media directly from that inspiration. It makes it a lot easier to get your voice out there in front of your ideal clients. I got a wonderful question from a listener about conferences. Now, there's a bunch of stuff in here, but I want to focus on one element for a moment, which is sponsors. So there's two related moments. Can you make money from events? And should I have sponsors? The sponsors thing is interesting because it's one of the key ways to make events profitable. You've heard the stories. Events are very hard to make profitable. This is true. Let's bracket that for a minute. The key thing with sponsors for me has always been this. This is a line that you cross. You do not allow sponsors to dictate content unless it is explicit. And ideally, you would not make all of your attendees endure sponsor content. It would be optional or extremely short. So that's the main thing. There's like a separation of church and state. You want to have, I think an interesting approach to this is to make sure that all your attendees know the content, the programming is coming from the right place. You are choosing that content because you think it will create the most value for attendees, not because you were paid off by somebody. And it's very easy to do. Sponsors are cool with this. And there's other ways that sponsors can get shine. For example, they can sponsor an experience at the event. Like, hey, everybody's going to get professional headshots. And that was sponsored by this really cool company. Or we're all going to go on this boat trip. Or we're all going to go to this really great party. And the drinks were provided by this sponsor. So those are some ways you can integrate sponsors without degrading the quality of your event, but actually add to it. People are like, oh, it's so amazing. This company bought us all these great drinks or whatever. Now, the other thing I just want to touch on is typically there's three ways you're going to make money from events. And they are by having great scale. So there's a tipping point with particular types of venues. For example, with hotel venues in North America, that might be like 300 attendees. Once you start getting a lot of attendees to come to your conference, you can start making a profit on them. The second and most typical way to do it is via upsells. If you do the math on this, it's going to be a lot more effective than pricing your event at a premium. So ideally what you want to do is cover your costs, get people in the door at a rate where they're more likely to buy a ticket, and then a percentage of the people who come will purchase a relevant follow-on that can be 5 or 10x the price of the conference. And typically the cost of delivery for that follow-on will be less. I heard a story about how Alex Hormozi does this. He has a workshop that you go to that's $5,000 and the follow-on is $35,000. So you can see the dimensional pricing. There will be a percentage of all attendees, call it anywhere from 5 to 25% of attendees will take that follow-on product. So this is probably the most effective way to monetize your events. The third and final one will be these sponsors that this listener is talking about. And sponsorship pricing, there's a lot of literature out there about how to do this. You can look at what the key conferences in your niche are doing, and you can speak with sponsors directly about what they want. It's a bit of a sales process, but it is an effective way to make your events profitable. I just want to mention that, yes, a lot of events are not profitable. They are break-even enterprises, and at that, they still can be worth it. Why? Because it's a delivery mechanism. It's a retention mechanism. It's a way to deliver value to your clientele, get them knowing each other, networking with each other. It's like an incredible way to, put a lot of positive energy into your brand and maximum learning potential. So they can be really, really sticky, creating deep relationships between your team, the clients getting to know each other. This can be an incredible tool to retain your customers longer and to do more business with them in the end. So if you haven't yet hosted an event for your customer base, I think it's fantastic. The key caveat with all of this is we would call it the team takeover. So you have this event coming up that is not profitable. It really does suck in a ton of team energy. So figuring out where your boundaries are there, what your firewall is, how you're staffing up. You want to be careful about taking away like core value driving activities in the business in order to host an event, because it can take over your team for weeks, or in our case, it's happened for months, because it's such a big deal to meet people in person. You want to deliver for them. There's a lot of intensity around it. So having a really strong budget for the event planner, for making sure things are going to be organized really intelligently, for thinking through every single moment of that event. We call it like the conveyor belt, like when you go to a conference, you should get on that conveyor belt, and you can walk forward or walk backwards if you want, but if you don't move at all, you're going to know exactly what every minute of that day is going to be happening. It's going to be super clear. That should be the target for anybody hosting an event. Okay, cool. So we covered a lot of things here, how to make money from events, and should you have sponsors. Why am I talking about this? I hosted a crap ton of events, so they're awesome. You should try one out.